It began one chilly Friday night when Skylar received the message, "Hey, I need a favor tonight." Belle Harrington's rich, beautiful name blinked on the screen. They weren't quite untouchable, the type of female who never wore the same clothes twice and had her own driver. In the campus hallway, friends more like classmates exchanged courteous nods. So when Belle messaged her out, unexpectedly, Skylar looked at her phone in shock. "I wonder what type of favor she..." My pulse was thumping like a bass drum as I typed the response. "I need a girl for a party tonight. It only took one night to..." Skylar's eyebrows rose up, making my ex envious. "You mean a phony date?" "Yes, act as though we're together, and I'll make sure she notices. I'll send her a car." It seemed ridiculous, and perhaps Skylar had always been interested in Belle, but he was a little desperate. Beneath modest smiles and silent appreciation, there had been a small crush that she never pursued. "Why not spend a single night in the fantasy world?" she said, her fingers shaking. A sleek black sedan arrived outside Skylar's building an hour later, and I said, "I'll do it." The driver climbed into the rear seat, nerves tingling, and opened the door without saying anything, like if she were someone important. She chose a dress made of tight black velvet that embraced her in all the areas she often attempted to conceal the gathering, which took place at Belle's beach house outside of the city. She saw her Belle at a place that was filled with soft lights, loud music, and females in heels laughing beneath the stars, wore a crimson silk dress, and emerged from the crowd like a dream scene. Her blonde hair was styled in beautiful waves, dress that hugged her curves and shimmered in the light. When she looked at Skylar, her lips truly caught the light. Belle murmured in a low voice, "You clean up well?" "Sky," with a slow, evil smile, Belle said, "You don't look too bad yourself." Skylar swallowed hard and smoothly. After a soft giggle, she stretched out and placed a warm, steady hand on Skylar's waist, causing her body to freeze for a moment. I was momentarily taken aback by how delicate yet assured the touch felt. "And I need her to..." "My ex-girlfriend," Belle whispered, her lips grazing Skylar's ear. "Ivy's name is Ivy, and she's over there acting as though she doesn't notice me." After Skylar tipped her head a little and saw that she was Ivy Sharp, beautiful, and far away. She stood like even from the other side of the room, Skylar could see the marble statue in the corner, drinking, but her gaze was fixed on them. "Sense the strain." "Hold my hand," Belle murmured, and Skylar did as he was told. Something changed the warmth of Belle's fingers, their physical proximity, and the expression in her eyes didn't feel like... Skylar recognized what Ivy was feeling, but she wasn't sure if she was envious or not. She had an unanticipated feeling that kept her from wanting Belle to let go, and Belle didn't. She continued to cling on, but Skylar wasn't sure how long. Her waist, yet it seemed as though time had stopped. The music pounded all around them, and bodies were moving on the beach. Belle's hand was all Skylar could feel as laughter reverberated from the corners. It should have felt phony, warm, steady, and little possessive, to be a show or an effort to make an ex-boyfriend jealous. But the way Belle leaned in her body, coming very close, enough to make Skylar's heart race, but it didn't feel like pretending. Belle whispered to her, "Not anymore, you're doing good." Skylar's lips were so close that she could feel her breath on her cheek. She nodded, not sure if she should thank her or inquire why. Ivy had undoubtedly seen them, but Belle was still clinging to her. Ivy's gaze had not left them across the deck. Her face was inscrutable due to her mouth being clenched in a rigid line. Belle looked to smirk as she pulled Skylar a little as Skylar felt her eyes searing through their skin. Taking her hand, she led her to the fire pit and murmured, "Come on," getting closer. Area farther from the music and nearer the sea breeze. The crowd dispersed, leaving only a few girls conversing close to the flames. Belle took a seat on a padded bench and tapped the area next to her. After a brief moment of hesitation, Skylar sat down, and Belle crossed. She angled her body so that her legs were facing her, and her fingertips trailed lightly along the border of... Even though Skylar's dress isn't doing anything improper, it's enough to make her gasp. "You're actually kind good at pretending," Belle asked, her eyes glimmering. Skylar's voice inquired. Belle cocked her head softer than she meant to, asking, "Who mentioned pretending?" The statement caused Skylar to... For a moment, she wasn't sure she heard correctly, but Belle didn't snicker or laugh as if it were a joke. Instead, she looked at... Skylar seemed sincere when she said that something had happened in this moment that neither she nor I had anticipated. Belle added, almost as if she were saying aloud, "I really like you this much." Skylar gulped hard. He didn't anticipate someone real, but he just needed someone lovely. Suddenly, I realized how close they were sitting. "You don't really know me." Belle stated that you don't care about followers, the cloud, or any other superficial thing because you're smart. You're quiet, but not in a dull way. And girls are obsessed with you. I'd like to know more. In a sense, Skylar was at a loss for words because she wasn't used to receiving compliments, especially from girls like Belle. Rich was self-assured and in charge of every area they entered. But at the moment, Belle didn't seem like that girl, appeared more sensitive, sincere, and possibly even vulnerable. I didn't anticipate you to be like this, Skylar acknowledged in a voice that was hardly audible above a whisper. I assumed you'd. Belle grinned and said, that's the picture that helps when you're trying to keep up with girls like Ivy. The term caused Skylar to look back at the Ivy party, was still there, acting as though she was engaged in a conversation with another female, but her eyes continued to dart in their heading. A brief moment of genuine, piercing jealousy crossed Skylar's face, and she turned around without thought, put a gentle hand on Belle's leg and said, well, she's definitely watching. Good, Belle said, but for a long moment, her gaze was fixed on Skylar's eyes rather than Ivy's. Belle's cheekbones flickered with orange light as the fire blazed next to them, but neither of them said anything. Belle leaned slowly and purposefully toward Skylar's heart, hammering it. The space between them felt electric. Yet just before they could even meet, someone exclaimed, Brielle. Belle blinked as the voice cut the moment like glass. A tall brunette with 2 drinks in her hand was approaching them as she sat back, her fingers moving away from Skylar's knee. With a fake smile on Belle's face, the girl replied, I've been looking for you, while clicking her heels over the deck. Hi, Dahlia. Skylar sensed the change in energy as the softness was immediately hardened. This wasn't the plan, and judging by the way Dahlia regarded Skylar with curiosity, assessing her, it was obvious that she wasn't just a buddy. Who's this Dahlia? Belle inquired, her gaze narrowing, opened her lips, but before she could say anything, Skylar said in a quiet voice, I'm her date. Belle then grinned once again and said, Not. Belle didn't correct Skylar. She didn't roll her eyes or laugh. Fake. Not smug, just real, her eyes, or dismiss it as if it were a natural part of the performance. But instead she grinned slowly and purposefully, saying she enjoyed listening to Skylar say, I'm her date, aloud. And it landed like a factual statement rather than a game. Dahlia's gaze darted between them, her smile becoming more. She gave Belle one of the drinks while maintaining eye contact with Skylar, grinning. I didn't know you were into quiet, she said. Kinds, she added in a lovely but poisonous voice. I had no idea you were interested in my affairs, but Belle answered with ease. It's good to meet you. Dahlia didn't even flinch. That caused her to blink once before laughing as if it didn't disturb her. Skylar remarked, You're not from the usual crowd, so I guess I'm not, in a tone that stretched the term like taffy. Her face was composed, but her heart was racing. She wasn't used to girls like Dahlia, who smiled and wore perfume like armor, with their teeth. But Belle felt more courageous for some reason as she sat closer and pressed her knee against Skylar's. Skylar continued, I'm not even sure where that courage came from, but I always like a surprise. Dahlia's smile wavered, but it was sufficient, she added, taking a sip of her drink and obviously reevaluating the circumstances. She stood there for a few seconds looking uncomfortable, as if she debated whether to say something else or simply back off, but ultimately decided to go, saying, Well, she stated in a sugary sweet voice, You two get back to it. Don't do anything I wouldn't do. Belle waved her away. Without a second look, Belle yelled as soon as Dahlia vanished into the mob. Okay, that was kind of hot. He laughed softly and turned to face Skylar with fresh warmth. Me holding my own. You shutting her down so smoothly, Skylar said, raising an eyebrow. Didn't realize you had that in you. Skylar grinned, her self-assurance startling even herself. To be honest, neither did I. Belle, leaning back, she extended her arms along the back of the bench, delicately grazing Skylar's back with her fingers. Shoulders since Ivy left. That girl has been attempting to enter my life. I believe she assumed I would simply fall into. And did you? Skylar asked Belle in her lap, not out of jealousy, but out of curiosity. Not once, she said, tilting her head. She's calculated, quite sure, but there's nothing beneath, no tenderness. Her gaze met Skylar's once more. Not like yours. Belle's compliments felt risky, like walking barefoot over glass. But Skylar wasn't sure what to say, wanting to quit. Her voice fell low when she wanted to say anything, and there was something hypnotic about the way she spoke. Skylar muttered, I'm here to play, but you're just saying that in order to put on a show. I would have kissed you back there if I were playing. Belle replied in a quiet, solemn voice. But I didn't. Before Belle could stop herself, Skylar questioned, why not? Too much time was spent staring at her lips, because I didn't want our first kiss to be for her, she explained. The fire between them was genuine now, not even flickering. As Skylar's breath caught quietly, they sat so near that it was burning steadily and slowly. Then what are we doing? They asked. Belle stared at Skylar as if she were trying to figure out the answer herself, the words scarcely coming out of her mouth. I'm not sure, but I don't want to stop. Suddenly, a wind gust came from the sea. Without saying anything, Belle removed her soft knit shawl and laid it over Skylar's body. Not to brag. Her hands hovered over Skylar's shoulders, their fingers grazing her collarbone. Dahlia was long gone, and Ivy was no longer visible. This wasn't for... Belle's hand moved down Skylar's arm until their fingers reconnected, and she gripped them tightly like she refused to leave. After the party, Belle said, "Do you want to stay with me?" Skylar didn't even consider it. Perhaps one word would be daring and honest. Foolish, but so was falling in love with a girl who invited her for just one night. Still, she remained, and as Skylar followed Belle around the house, the commotion from the celebration surrounding them receded. Belle's soft but firm fingers were still around her, and that one point of contact felt more reassuring. More than everything else, the beach home was enormous, with golden light and white walls. Glass doors leading to the sea were still open, and people were still dancing in corners and laughing in the living room. But none of them. Belle led Skylar up the broad spiral staircase without even looking back, and Skylar's heart raced with. It felt unreal, like a story, because she wasn't used to this type of attention, not just being noticed, but being picked. She was witnessing something happen to someone else, someone more worthy, braver, more attractive. However, Belle didn't appear to perceive her that way. Instead, she gave her the impression that she was exactly who she wanted when they entered. Skylar's breath seized when he saw Belle's bedroom, which was gorgeous with muted soft linens. Candles glowed on the dresser, providing golden light on the vast window that overlooked the dark, shimmering sea. Belle remarked, "I like quiet," letting go of Skylar's hand as the shadows moved over the floor. Even though everyone would think I'm noisy, Skylar entered the room softly and kicked off her heels as she walked near the bed, taking it all in gently. "I didn't anticipate your room to feel this way." Belle turned to hear the quiet Skylar murmur, "It feels like you breathe here." For a second, they just stood there, neither of them moving, and then her lips curled slightly, "Which is what I do?" Belle returned to her and gently brushed a lock of hair behind Skylar's ear, saying, "You don't have to be." "I'm not nervous, because I'm not going to force you to do anything you don't want to do," she added quietly. "I'm anxious because I truly want to be here with you and Skylar said, "I do not want this to be a game." Belle's face changed to a more gentle expression. Sadder, she moved in closer so Skylar could sense her warmth. "It began as a game," Belle remarked, "but as soon as I saw you exit that automobile, it ceased seeming like one." "Skylar, really?" Belle nodded slowly, blinking in astonishment. "I thought I just needed someone," she said, "to make Ivy feel as like she had lost something by holding my hand and kissing me in front of her. But then you entered and I became aware that I might have been losing all along." The room was silent. The only sounds in between were Skylar's heartbeat and the gentle rush of waves outside. Belle then extended her hand once more slowly this time, and softly placed it on Skylar's waist the way she had at the party before. But since there was no audience and no Ivy, there was no need to pretend. Belle's sides were resting when Skylar stepped into her own hands. Their foreheads touched in a subtle yet significant way. Their breaths mixed, and then Belle finally tipped her head and planted a kiss. It was leisurely, intensely delicate, and not hurried, furious, or desperate-like. They both knew they had discovered what they were looking for in the other, and Skylar's body melted, gently at first, then a bit more boldly. As their lips sank into Belle's, Belle spoke in a whisper. When they eventually separated by barely an inch, Skylar nodded, her forehead still pressed to hers, since it felt too real. For the first time in a long time, Skylar didn't feel anything as they stood there holding one another. She didn't feel like a background girl, the quiet sort that nobody noticed, and felt as like she had to hide or shrink. "Stay here tonight," Belle murmured again, more quietly, feeling recognized and needed, not for Ivy, not for the plan, but for me. Skylar gazed into her green eyes and shining in the candlelight, and she nodded. "All right." Belle let her approach carefully. When the bed pulled back the blankets, they took their time and didn't strip in a spectacular movie scene. Simply climbed in, nestled up under the blankets, and allowed their bodies to naturally discover one another with their fingers intertwined. Breath slowed and Belle's room's quiet. With the ocean murmuring outside and the aroma with vanilla candles in the air, Skylar came to the realization that this was not the conclusion of the evening, but rather the beginning of something. Golden streaks appeared on the white linens as the early light softly poured through the large window. Skylar awoke first, blinking slowly as her body acclimated to the warmth wrapped about their legs. For a few while, Skylar remained still as Belle's arm was wrapped around her waist, and her breath was steady against Skylar's neck. She didn't want to, since everything seemed too ideal and there was no sound, music, no strangers laughing, only the distant ocean and the slight scent of vanilla in the pillow, combined with the beat of a heart crushed against hers, something soft, pricey, and familiar that was entirely. Belle now tipped Skylar's head. Belle's blonde hair was disheveled when she turned her head slightly and glanced at the girl next to her. She looked real, even though her mascara was hardly there and her lipstick was long gone. A few strands were dropping over her cheek. Skylar felt her chest tighten in a way she wasn't used to, even though she was much more attractive now than she had ever been under party lights. Ready for this was more than just a moment. Something had changed. It was more than just attraction, had silently taken root in her chest as they slept, causing Belle to stir slightly and twitch her brows in front of her eyes. Finally opened, and after a moment of disoriented blinking, she turned her attention to Skylar and, "True morning," she whispered, and Skylar returned the smile. "Morning." They closed their limbs and remained inches apart. Belle softly ran her fingers along Skylar's arm, which was still twisted in the sheets, as if she were learning the shape of. She whispered, seemingly still in shock. "You stayed? You asked me to," Skylar said softly. "And I wanted to," and Belle gave her a look. "You don't regret it, do you?" questioned Skylar, but Belle hesitated as if she were trying to read something behind her eyes. "No, I don't." Skylar shook her head, releasing tension she hadn't noticed before. They lay in silence once more, but not because they didn't want to. She had been holding slowly, letting her shoulders drop. "Good," she mumbled, "have things to say." But they didn't have to say them immediately. Their newfound comfort was profound. "I don't usually do this," Belle said, as if their bodies had figured something out while their minds were still processing it. Remarked in a quiet voice after a while, as if she didn't want to ruin the moment. "I don't mean the phony dating aspect. I've regrettably done this more than once, but this time I woke up close to someone and didn't want them to go. Why now?" "Belle, I don't do this." Skylar shifted on her side, facing her completely. "I hesitated because I don't feel like I have to be anything when I'm with you. I'm terrified because I'm not flawless or untouchable. I can just be who I am." "Belle, you don't frighten me in the slightest." Skylar reached up and softly tucked a strand of hair behind Belle's ear. "Ivy used to say that I was overly dramatic, and that I chuckled gently," her eyes sparkling. "She didn't know what to do with your heart," Skylar remarked, adding that it was too intense. "Just saying, that doesn't mean it's too much." Belle blinked, and Skylar briefly believed she would cry. But Belle leaned in and gave her a gentle forehead kiss instead. "You're dangerous, Skylar," she mumbled against her skin during a second kiss that seemed more intimate than anything else. Skylar closed her eyes and said, "You make me want to believe in something real again." Her heart was pounding in her chest. "Then believe," she uttered softly, "because I'm not going anywhere." The silence encased the room for a little longer before Belle's sigh was cut off by the distant buzz of a phone. Her countenance quickly altered as she reached for her nightstand and looked at the screen. Her hand froze, and Skylar sat up. Belle didn't respond straight away. Although she was a little worried, everything was okay. She placed with the phone facing down and a perfectly inscrutable gaze. Ivy's name fell into the room like. Skylar felt a knot in her stomach. What does she want? Belle gave a weary, somewhat. She seems to have seen enough last night to suddenly miss me. Skylar, judging by her bitter smile, swallowed hard and stared at her for a long time before asking, "Are you going to talk to her?" Skylar met her after she said, "Only if you'll still be here after. Keep your eyes focused. I'm not the one who left." And Belle nodded gravely as Belle sat on the side of the bed with the phone still, wondering whether that one phrase had told her everything she needed to know. Skylar remained silent next to her, observing Belle's shoulders as they were placed face down on the nightstand, as if it were radioactive, with a mixture of hesitancy and frustration. I rose and fell. The gentle morning light felt heavier now that it wasn't warm and dreamy yet piercing, as if it were shining on something they couldn't ignore. Skylar said, "You don't have to answer her. Just because she saw you with me doesn't mean she's nervous," she replied softly, trying not to let her own anxiety show through. "Gets a say anymore." Belle took a while to react, her fingers twitching against the sheet's edge as though considering whether to grab the phone or put it down entirely. She said, "It's not that simple. She injured you, but I told her about myself, and I don't do it lightly. She made you feel like you were too much. And now that she can see you moving on," Skylar added in a harder tone, "wants you back. But that's control, not love." Belle turned her head. Skylar's eyes slowly locked with mine, revealing something raw and vulnerable. "I'm afraid, and you're right. But I also understand how simple it is to slip into." Skylar sat up. "Old habits. When your heart remembers someone's shape, even when your head knows better." Her voice softened once again as she pulled the blanket about herself. "I'm not asking you to. I want you to put your past behind you and focus on the present. Choose what seems right." Belle gave her a. She opened the message, but Skylar couldn't see the contents, and after a long moment, she eventually sighed and reached for the phone. But she could see them in Belle's face. A trace of longing, confusion, remorse, and almost fury. "She wants to." Finally, Belle responded. "We want to meet. Are you going?" Dangled in midair like a thread poised to break. Belle took another look at Skylar. Skylar blinked, not by herself. but with a steadier look in her eyes. You want me to? Belle's voice was firm now, and I added, come, I want her to see the girl who made me smile without asking me to shrink. Skylar's heart pounded in her chest, reminding me not to fall for her delusions once more. I wish you were there. She had agreed to go on a fictitious date for one night as part of the plan, not to watch a tumultuous reunion. But somewhere, she had stopped acting along the way, and now it felt strange to let Belle face Ivy without her. Okay, she said, following a lengthy pause. Skylar answered, then let's go. The meeting was scheduled for the afternoon at a peaceful rooftop cafe, downtown neutral ground. No loud music, no partygoers, just the reality. Coffee Belle wore her clothes with care, not to impress, but more because Skylar stood next to her as she dressed for armor, her blonde hair pulled back in a neat twist, and she wore high boots and a nice blazer. They were 5 minutes early, and Ivy was dressed in a fitting coat and soft jeans. She was more grounded, less polished, but strong in her own way, was already there, sitting at a table in the corner, wearing sunglasses to conceal her eyes. When she noticed, Belle's lips formed an expression that was too rehearsed to be genuine. But when she saw, as they got closer, Ivy exclaimed, you brought her, and Skylar's jaw tensed. Of course I did, Belle answered. Skylar immediately sat down, taking the seat next to her. She was quiet but visible, her fingers grazing the... Ivy sat back in her chair beneath Belle's table, her lips pressed together. Don't you waste time. Belle chuckled softly. You don't message me either, even for you. That's impressive, less than 24 hours after you've been avoiding me for weeks. Ivy removed her eyeglasses to show stunning yet icy eyes. I made a mistake, she stated in a measured voice. I allowed my fear of your intensity to interfere with but it was never about you to see you with someone else. Belle interrupted. It never was, but you managed to make everything revolve around you every time. Skylar listened in silence as Belle's voice remained steady after Ivy glanced between them and noticed something for the first time. Nearly human in appearance, sometimes with regret or bitterness. Do you love her? Ivy, Belle questioned in a hushed voice, then turned to face Skylar before grinning. She answered honestly, I don't know yet, but it's not a staged smile or performance. What I do know is that she makes me feel safe, which is more than you ever did. Ivy just stood, nodded rigidly, and turned to leave without saying another word. Belle released a breath she had been holding since they sat down, and Skylar grabbed her hand beneath the... She muttered, you did it? And Belle nodded. No, she added softly. We did. There was silence during the elevator journey down from the rooftop cafe. Not the awkward type, not peaceful, neither stiff or heavy. Skylar stood next to Belle, their hands loosely clasped, her thumb lightly grazing. Belle hadn't spoken since Ivy left the table, and her face was over her knuckles as the city moved outside the glass. Unreadable once again, but Skylar knew that the polished calm was coming back automatically. She now understood that the silence was shelter from the door, not emptiness, opened on the main floor, and Belle led them out while putting her sunglasses back over her eyes. Down the street, the heat was piercing, the wind was strong, and Skylar followed her, trying not to push but having to recognize the thoughts racing through her mind. Want to discuss it? Belle halted walking as she inquired softly, her fingers slightly clenched over Skylar's yes, but not in this place. Join me. They drove a short distance to a more tranquil area of the city, where rows of historic townhouses and trees bordered the... Belle led Skylar into a street with walkways and enough quiet to let the breeze to speak. Skylar had never seen the narrow brownstone one before, but it was stylishly warm inside, secluded and well-furnished, with a subtle scent of books and lavender. This is where There aren't many people. Go when I need to think, Belle remarked, taking off her blazer and hanging it over the back of a chair. Belle moved to the window bench, and Skylar, who knew I even owned this property, followed her inside, kitchen, and filled 2 glasses with water. Why did Skylar ask me so abruptly? Belle came back that night and gave her a glass before they sat down. Why did you message me when you could have chosen anyone? You're the only one who has ever treated me like an idiot. So I'm down next to her, curling her legs under her. You didn't want anything from me, not influence or favors. She continued, not boast-worthy tales. You simply lived next to me, and that made you the... Skylar gazed, the one person I trusted to tell the truth, even if you were unaware of it. I assumed I was invisible to you, so I was shocked when she said that. Belle responded, you weren't. I saw you long before I messaged you. And I smiled faintly. When reading in class in the library, you used to pull your hair up as if you wanted to focus completely to even. I found it adorable that Skylar's cheeks blushed when she breathed close to a book. Belle whispered, my curse is that I notice everything. But I don't always. I feel it with you. After a moment of silence, they reconnected, and Belle gazed. You want to know how I felt when Ivy left today? Skylar, looking down at her hands, nodding. I felt both relief and sorrow, not for her, but for who I believed I was when I loved her. I continued to shrink in an attempt to fit into the space she had made for me, because I believed that love required earning a spot. You don't have to earn it. Skylar leaned over and took her hand in someone's world. Belle's eyes were glassy and furious as she slowly looked up. I'm not sure how to be gentle. I constantly say sarcastic things, overthink things, and shut down when I'm in a tight spot. Skylar, I've never had a genuine relationship with someone that didn't turn against me when I'm afraid. I don't want perfection. Belle, I want the girl who smiles and squeezes her hand, saw me in a library when I didn't even believe I was there. The person who endured every look from her former partner, and Belle's voice cracks a little, yet you still choose to hold my hand. You make it sound so straightforward because Skylar whispered, we're here, you and me, and nobody else's, behaving as though nothing had happened. Belle softly leaned in and placed her forehead on, I don't know if I'm ready to fall in love again, Skylar said. Their lips touched once again, not in a hurry, and Skylar whispered back, just fall into this moment, and I'll catch you. Retaliation, not to prove a point, but simply to share a breath of quiet honesty and the beginning of a delicate and genuine thing when they separated. Belle pressed her cheek against Skylar's shoulder and said, in a whisper, I'm scared. Me too, Skylar said. But we're not alone. And for once, Belle accepted it, and the days that followed were filled with gentle golden waves. Huge announcement, no status reports, and no need to tell anyone. Belle, as though they had always been destined to share the same place. Skylar and I slipped into each other's lives. However, there was no denying gravity. They sipped coffee in the mornings, while cuddled up on Belle's brownstone window bench. They moved through bookstores without talking much, occasionally pausing to point out things while reading silently and stroking each other's legs. Titles they adored occasionally. Belle would gaze at Skylar when she felt that she no longer looked like she couldn't believe that one night, while rain softly knocked on the windows, someone had noticed her without the armor and stayed. As they watched a movie that neither of them was really paying attention to, Skylar rested on the couch with her head in Belle's lap. Belle's fingers played rhythmically and softly with Skylar's hair while she was distracted, and it felt the safest. You know, Skylar remarked in a voice that was almost audible above a whisper. Belle looked down and said, what do you mean? Keep waiting for this to fall apart. This is unbelievable. You are untouchable, menacing, wealthy, and stunning. Belle sighed and bent down to kiss her forehead, saying, I'm just me. You're the only person who ever made me feel like you're more than just anything. Sky, you're the reason I can breathe at last. Skylar, I could be touched without being used. Didn't respond, but she pressed her face against Belle's leg, allowing the truth of what she had said to sink in. However, not everything remained silent within her. A few days later, while Belle was Skylar's phone while she was out meeting with her father's legal team over what she called inheritance nonsense, buzzed by a message from an unknown number. Skylar gazed at the screen, uncertain if she should open it. Her thumb lingered before tapping. I'm not attempting to make trouble, but you should be aware that Belle avoids relationships and instead retains individuals till be careful. Skylar's stomach flopped after they bore her. It was petty. She didn't respond, and she didn't tell Belle, but nevertheless, it found a hole in her heart and crept right in. Skylar's thoughts drifted to the message that night as Belle cuddled against her side and made gentle circles around her back. She feared it rather than believing it. What if Ivy was correct? What if Belle woke up one morning and, when they were eating breakfast on the rooftop terrace the following morning, Skylar realized she had made a mistake and at last questioned the what happens when you get tired of me was the question that had been bothering her. Belle is midway through a drink of, what did you hear me say? Tea froze. Silently, Skylar remarked. You're not someone who remains still for a long time. What happens if you want someone else? Belle carefully put down her cup and looked at her, her face concerned but not angry. Did Ivy say anything to you? Skylar paused. But I believe I was asking myself that question before I don't blame you for worrying if I've made folks feel anything. Did Belle take a big breath? I won't lie. I've previously approached love as a game of control and power. Skylar looked down at you regarding that, her fingers curling into the side of her. Belle leaned out and gently lifted her chin. But I'm not interested in being that girl anymore. I want to change into the kind of person that deserves you, Skylar. And I don't want to lose you because of who I was before. Belle got up abruptly and started to go after Skylar's eyes burned. Skylar followed in confusion inside until Belle returned with something in her hand. She put a velvet sack on the table and opened it to reveal, I was planning to gift you a thin, delicate silver bracelet with a tiny charm shaped like a book. Skylar's breath hitched when I was certain Belle spoke, but I knew I was already. Belle stated that it's more than simply a present. It's a pledge that I won't leave. That this time, Skylar, I'm going to make a sincere effort to love someone the correct way. Then I'll promise something too, she muttered as she grabbed the bracelet in trembling hands and put it on her wrist. Belle stepped up and gave her a slow, tender kiss, the type that said, I'll trust you even when I'm scared. didn't require a crowd or an explanation, the sort that declared, "This is real." Moreover, none of them was acting this time. The door was closed, so past may knock as often as it wanted.